Brussels Bites, a podcast about technology, digital society, and European policy. Brought to you by the Martin Centre with Dimitar Lilkov.
Hi, and thanks for joining another episode of Brussels Bites. Before I introduce today's guest, I just want to take a step back and say a warm thank you to all of our listeners in the past 6 months. One of our recent episodes passed the mark of 10,000 listens on SoundCloud, which means a lot for me, and it also means a lot for our fantastic communications team here at the Martin Centre. I hope that it also means that more and more people are getting engaged and interested in technology and European policies. As I like to say, this podcast is about politics, but also about our society. A society which is at a critical juncture. Think about it. Social media, disinformation, artificial intelligence, facial recognition, surveillance. The list is growing. Where do we stand on these issues? Where are they taking us? And what is their impact on our communities? Questions like this can provoke you. They can excite you, but they can also make you anxious. This is why national governments, civil society, the European Union, media, and big technological companies have an important responsibility in handling these challenges and making sure that Europe remains the best place you can live, the best place you can work and prosper. I'm extremely grateful that our today's guest is a professional who can hopefully address these big questions and address these anxieties. Today we're joined by John Frank, who is in charge of the European team of Microsoft here in Brussels. John Frank is Vice President, EU Government Affairs in Brussels. He was previously Vice President, Deputy General Counsel, and Chief of Staff at Microsoft Corporation in Redmond, Washington. From 1996 to 2002, John Frank led Microsoft's Legal and Corporate Affairs Group for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, focusing on issues such as privacy, security, and consumer protection. Prior to joining Microsoft, John Frank was an attorney in San Francisco. John, it's a pleasure to have you on our podcast.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
John, you've been engaged in leading positions at Microsoft, both in Europe and in the USA. What are the notable differences in handling government affairs across the Atlantic and here in Europe, here in Brussels?
Well, first, let's say I've been living in Brussels for 4 years now, and I very much enjoy it. The positive side of government affairs in Brussels is that it is very collegial here. We have political parties, and yet the political parties generally work together across coalitions to work on important issues. And I think sometimes in Washington, D.C., we clearly see a partisan divide, sort of blue-red, Republican-Democrat. And so I think that that's an important difference. Another important difference is because in the United States Congress, it has the right to initiate legislation, each member. It's very easy for measures to come forward. Far fewer things actually get passed. Where here in Brussels, once a measure comes out from the Commission, it almost always gets completed. And so the work of preparing for what comes out becomes the critical factor here. But overall, many of the same values and principles in public policy are consistent across the groups. And the very talented people, both in Washington and Brussels, working on public policy.
And focusing on the states as a little warm up to our conversation, do you think that tech issues are growing in prominence? Now we have the presidential election upcoming in 2020, and we've seen even some of the presidential candidates taking specific positions on big tech issues. Do you think that these questions are important for the electorate in the States?
There's no doubt that technology is transforming our lives and our economy. the technology sector in the United States economy is growing from 5% to 10% of the national economy over a 15-year period. So just the economic impact, economic growth is significant. And in this new era of data science and artificial intelligence and cloud computing, we're seeing some profound challenges for how technology will affect our lives and our businesses. And so I think that there are important issues that are being discussed, and including, how will this affect our democratic processes?
Absolutely. I just mentioned the U.S. elections, but recently in Europe we had the European Parliament elections. And one of the big focuses of the previous commission and the pledges for the upcoming von der Leyen commission is the question of artificial intelligence, the question on developing a rigorous ethical framework for artificial intelligence, and maybe even specific legislation on AI. Do you think that ethics is enough when we talk about AI, or we should even go beyond that?
Well, I believe that ethics are essential as a foundation first step. And until you kind of think through some of the ethical issues, I think it becomes very tough to try to come up with legislative solutions that address problems. Having said that, artificial intelligence is very broad. It'll touch every part of the economy and every part of our lives. And so trying to come up with legislative proposals that are going to address every issue in a horizontal way is a challenge. There's no doubt about it. There are some foundational things that are important. But I do think it will be important to be willing to say, look, let's take some specific scenarios where there are concerns and try to address those concerns in a very thoughtful manner. And I think ethics is the foundation for how we're going to deal with that, because ultimately we want our society to reflect our values. And society is not going to accept technology or social change that doesn't reflect our social values.
And here comes the big question. How do we design technology-neutral legislation and also make sure that we don't hamper innovation, we don't put Europe in a disadvantage, and we don't stifle our businesses? How do we design this legislation?
Right. I think the important part to get right is recognizing that the most important economic investment we can make these days is our people. We need education. We need continuing education. We can dream of the workforce of the future, but we have a workforce today of very talented people that we need to continue lifelong learning and growth, because jobs are evolving, and to capture the positive aspects of artificial intelligence, data science, we need people who can pivot and grow and learn. One of our customers came and spoke here in Brussels a few weeks ago. Outokumpu, it's a Finnish stainless steel manufacturer, and they were talking about the challenges they have of finding people to do cybersecurity in their company. Now, they've gone through this digital transformation where they've taken their factories and installed lots of digital sensors, and they've really dramatically refined and improved how they manufacture stainless steel. They're the largest manufacturer of stainless steel in the world. But what they said is it's easier to take a metallurgist and teach them more about data science or cybersecurity than it is to take somebody without any domain expertise and teach them how to apply their skill set to this area of metallurgy. So I think that that is the challenge for every business and every organization, training people and cross-training them to expand, to take advantage of the new opportunities. And of course, in our university and high school curriculums, including more quantitative skills. We live in a quantitative world, and so people need to embrace, learning more about what data science can do.
Absolutely. I want to dig deeper a bit on policy issues, and especially on regulating facial recognition. Your company has positioned itself as an advocate for increased government regulation in specific sectors. a notion that is not shared by all of the big tech companies. What's the logic behind Microsoft's stance and on the call for increased government regulation?
We've been very thoughtful about how our artificial intelligence technologies will be deployed. We've been working in artificial intelligence with Microsoft Research for decades. And we're now seeing facial recognition technology kind of reach both an improvement in accuracy, but more a dramatic decline in cost to deploy it. And so it's a easily available technology today. And yet we're concerned that if it's misapplied, it can do harmful things, and it can destroy consumer trust in technologies. There clearly are some very important use cases where facial recognition technology can make the world a safer, better place. But we also see scenarios where the industry hasn't been responsible enough about ensuring that technologies are used appropriately. The GDPR provides a very good foundation, and the police directive, law enforcement directive here in Europe for regulating this. And that's a very important start. But we need to build on that to make sure that we've, the GDPR, these statutes, they're important, but they can't answer every question. So we believe there's more to be done to provide clear guidelines or requirements about how police forces should use facial recognition technology and how they should review it. Similarly, the consumer or the commercial uses with consumers for facial recognition technology, they need to be thought through very carefully. When I go to the pharmacy and buy some cough syrup, I open up the package and there's disclosure forms telling me what the appropriate way to use the medication is and the limitations and how not to use it. Facial recognition technology deserves the same thing. People need to understand it's not an exact match, right? It's a suggested, this is a probable match. And that probability may be higher or lower depending on the circumstances.
But here comes the challenge. There's been voices in the U.S., for example, that for the time being there should be a blanket ban on facial recognition technology. There are certain privacy groups or even some media outlets which advocate that until we get it right, we should ban facial recognition technology. If I'm not mistaken, in California, I think the police force is not allowed to use facial recognition. So what's the right approach here?
Well, I don't think it's a terrible thing to say you're going to pause some deployments until you can get it right. I mean, I think you don't want to hold back technology, but in those special circumstances where you see a particular harm that you can identify, I think it's fine to say, look, let's get this right before we proceed. And so it is the exception, but I don't see that much of a problem of saying we're going to pause this for a while until we can work through some of the issues. I mean, there is a deep concern among many in the United States that facial recognition technology is less accurate for people with darker skin than lighter skin.
Potential biases
right,
ingrained in the technology.
And especially when it comes to policing, it's a sensitive case, and we don't want to have technologies deployed that are going to lead to inappropriate police action against minority populations.
The thing which really struck a chord with me was that in late 2018, Microsoft, your company, launched its 6 principles to guide Microsoft's facial recognition work, and it's one of the very first companies to actually speak freely and openly about this issue. These 6 principles for Microsoft when it comes to facial recognition, among them are fairness, accountability, non-discrimination, and the last one is lawful surveillance, which aims to safeguard democratic freedoms. Now my question to you is, where do we draw the line on what constitutes lawful surveillance and not? Does the company have its own standards and thresholds, or it relies on national legal systems and understanding of what is actually lawful?
Well, I think that we have principles that we are a floor for where we will use our technology. And I think, we hope that national standards will be at least at that level. I believe in Europe they are. Mm-hmm. I think European, again, the directives and some of the work that's been done on closed-circuit television surveillance, for example, have provided a good foundation, and the recognition that it's a matter of fundamental right that's being implicated leads to conclusions under European law that provide good protections. There was, I think, a significant court case. It's not a final ruling; it can still be appealed. But the South Wales Police, I believe, in September, in a UK court, where the court went through and analyzed very carefully, essentially, the European legislative framework that had been adopted by the UK, as well as the guidance that had been offered by the regulators and guidelines by the police department to ensure that this was properly used. And I think that's a very good starting point to extract out from that what are the best practices or requirements for any police department across Europe who wants to deploy this, that here's a legal framework for you to follow. And so I think that there's a good foundation in Europe. The parts of the world, there's not a good foundation.
Exactly.
Right? And the idea that I don't think any of us want to live in a world where cameras can monitor us everywhere we go and anybody can track, where we've been that day. I think some sense of individual privacy and in society is a very important part of who we are. And so we will not license our technology for surveillance. In many countries around the world, we turn down business. Mm-hmm. In countries where we fear that it'll be used for repression or broad surveillance.
We mentioned numerous times police forces and engagement with the security services. A couple of weeks ago, I recently finished Tools and Weapons, the book by your president, Brad Smith, and Carol Brown. One of the recurring themes in the book, which made an impression for me, and in different chapters, is Microsoft's numerous clashes with governments and legal enforcement on sharing of personal information or device information. Here, I think I quote on the top of my head, but I think Microsoft receives something in the region of 50,000 requests or subpoenas for exchange of information from 75 countries globally. As a company, exactly how do you draw the line on safeguarding privacy and user rights and actually being able to cooperate with police forces? Have you had similar experiences in the company? Which were the toughest battles for you?
In my previous role, I one of the teams that was part of my group was the law enforcement national security team, and we worked to process these requests from law enforcement. And keeping citizens safe is an incredibly important function of government. There's no doubt about it. And so the work the police do is essential to our society. But our role is not to service the police. We're there to serve our customers. And so when we receive orders or requests, we've got very clear policies that we publish about the kind of information we can provide. And a lot of, 95% of the requests we receive is simple account information. And so, who's behind, the account with a Hotmail address, mm-hmm. for example. And it's simple registration information. That's most of the requests. About 5% of the requests, though, are for content. And in that, we carefully scrutinize to ensure that the request is lawful, by its terms, and that we're very thoughtful and make sure it's not overbroad, and we will provide that information in a very secure way to the police or courts when we get those orders. We have been willing to sue the United States government over issues. When the Snowden disclosures occurred, I was engaged in discussions with the FBI about wanting to, what we believe, set the record straight about the number of accounts involved, because the press accounts with the limited information they had available gave the impression that many more accounts were subject to lawful orders. And so we did sue the United States government in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, asserting our First Amendment right to free speech to be able to disclose publicly the broad number of accounts that we'd received. That case was eventually successfully settled. President Obama announced the settlement in a speech several months later, and enabled us to provide much more detailed information in our transparency reports that are on the web about the kinds of national security orders we receive and the number of accounts affected. We've also, a case that I initiated at Microsoft involved a warrant we received from a New York court for an email account that was stored in our Dublin, Ireland data center. And when we looked at the statute, our determination was that the U.S. law did not apply extraterritorially. Mm-hmm. That case eventually went to the Supreme Court. The case was never ruled on because Congress stepped up and adopted what's called the Cloud Act, which did two things. It clarified from Congress's point of view that the extraterritorial reach of the United States was confirmed, but that other governments could negotiate with the United States executive agreements that would set the terms by which the United States could access data about their citizens.
On an ad hoc, case-by-case basis?
Well, setting a legal framework. Mm-hmm. And so the European Commission has, with the Council's mandate, begun negotiations of an executive agreement between the European Union and the United States. It's an incredibly important agreement, and it's really important that it protects the fundamental rights and freedoms of Europeans.
Talking about this cooperation with governments, right now in Europe we have an interesting example. The European Commission proposed legislation legislating how a law enforcement authority in one country can directly approach an internet service provider for data which is stored in another country. So this is something which is currently occupying the minds of lawmakers in Europe as well. And right now I think it's going in a pipeline in the European Parliament, and it's a report on e-evidence. What do you deem is important when we talk about this information exchange in Europe? And how does Microsoft approach the issue here in Brussels?
We've been broadly supportive of an e-evidence legislative effort. We think it is important to be able to find ways that law enforcement can obtain the data it needs within an appropriate legal framework. And so the Commission's proposal on e-evidence did some very important things. Most importantly, it said, if a French court wants information about something that happened in France, but the data happens to be stored in Ireland, it has a right to get it. And that's I think, clarifying and does make a lot of sense. But it also sets up certain protections. And so a court in one country can't get from a service provider like Microsoft data about another government. Or if it's an organizational customer, that generally notices have to be given. We want a system that works for police, but also works for our customers, including our government customers and our commercial customers and our individual customers. So that's the key challenge in making this work. We're less, I'll give you an honest opinion, I don't think the council's position is very helpful. I think they stripped away many of the protections that the Commission had proposed. We're hopeful that the Parliament position will restore those protections and perhaps improve on where the Commission was. But this is a complicated process. It is important that we advance this legislation, and I hope that people will pay attention to it, because even though it may be a little complicated, it's fundamentally important to how we're going to live in a world of cloud computing.
2019 was especially in Brussels because of the European Parliament elections, and there was numerous concerns for disinformation, for potential cyber attacks, for potential hacking of our election. What's your take? Was Microsoft under heavy fire before the elections when it comes to cybersecurity?
I think we're living in a world where we just have to recognize that nation states are going to use cyberspace to advance their state goals in ways that many of us would find inappropriate. And the potential of disinformation has always been part of the political process. There's the old American joke: how can you tell politicians lying? It's that they're moving their lips. Now they might say they're moving their thumbs. But I think that there's an expectation that in the rough and tumble of political discussion, truth may not always be the winner. But it gets more complicated when we start living in a world where there is the potential for foreign interference, and also when we recognize that the online world and social media has an accelerating effect and an amplifying effect, where you can essentially bring your own orchestra to your message.
To tailor-made audiences, by the way.
Right.
Very specific
Right.
audiences.
So it is a major challenge. We've worked in this last election cycle to help political parties, think tanks, candidates, make sure that they keep their election, they keep their email and their documents secure from hacking and doxing. We've also been working on technologies that will enable people to verify that their vote was counted as they cast it, and that the total number of votes from an overall system can be verified. We call that Election Guard. We've also been fairly vocal in calling out instances where we see foreign interference or foreign nation-state attacks on our customers. And so we've notified over 10,000 customers this past year that a foreign government was targeting their account. So I think that's a significant problem. We believe that we need to find international solutions. The Paris call for trust and stability in cyberspace is a very important step. We believe we need to work together, because government can't solve this problem by itself. Industry can't solve this problem by itself. It's the multi-stakeholder approach that is going to ultimately get solutions that can help address some of these problems.
And our partners in the industry answering your call, do you find instances of positive cooperation across the industry?
We do find interest, because we tend to find industries are aligned, and so the chief information security officers of financial services institutions, they talk to each other, but they don't necessarily talk to the telecommunications companies or the IT companies over here, and so we open up the possibilities of collaborating on developing better solutions when we work across our kind of silos. And the last month or so, I've been in cybersecurity roundtables on this in Riga, in Helsinki, Madrid, and people are excited to get to go try to do something that is going to make a difference, because we need to create the world we want to live in. And this isn't a problem that we can just legislate ourselves out of. It does. We need to make our products more secure. We need to make our end-to-end experiences more secure, and we need to find ways to address cyber criminality in a more effective way, and we need to put constraints on how governments conduct malign activities online.
Absolutely. In closing, just a final question, because for me and for many people in Brussels, when they hear the name Microsoft, it rings a bell of the landmark case in EU competition law history in the early 2000s. From the distance of time, how important was the Microsoft Corp versus Commission case for the company, and how important was it for its future operations in Europe?
I spent several years working on that case, or those cases, and it was a difficult time for the company. We were slow to engage or to hear the message that was coming to us about some of our business practices that people considered unfair. And I think, regardless of setting aside the particular facts of the case, it's the broader message that had the bigger impact on us, right? It was that we need to make sure that we're listening to people in our industry, as well as in government and others, and be willing to take the feedback. You could say we didn't get it, and we eventually figured out we needed to get it. And I think that's important. And as a company, the transitions that have taken place to now, we're one of the leading open source software companies in the world. We contribute more to open source projects than almost any other company. And with GitHub, we're trying to create a great place for open source software projects to be carried out. So we've transformed who we are as a company. And if you look back at time, those competition cases were a pivotal moment that changed the course of our company.
What about competition policy in 2020, in the upcoming decade? Many people are getting anxious, and they're criticizing regulators that competition procedures take a very long time. Sometimes it's difficult to prove harm on users, and that even if there's a fine to be imposed on a company, regardless which company, these fines are actually small given their overall turnover, given their revenues, and that competition policy is not really effective. Maybe you're not the best person to ask you this question, but how do you see competition policy in the next decade?
I think that's President-designate von der Leyen is. I think it's an important innovation. We'll see how it works, but it's a really interesting experiment by having executive vice president with portfolios both for the digital and for competition. And Vice President Vestager can have the option of looking at, is competition enforcement the right way here, or is the regulatory approach the right way? And without being so concerned about which silo, which part of the commission it might move to. So I think it's a positive to look at this, because there are cases where enforcement is appropriate, and yet the challenge is, how do you regulate a fast-moving industry in ways that have a sustained impact on competitiveness. And so I think that looking at the enforcement and regulation continuum is a very healthy development.
John, thank you very much. John Frank, Vice President of EU Government Affairs here in Brussels. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
That was today's episode of Brussels Bites.